Mrs. Margaret Hayes was the kind of woman who exuded grace and warmth, even in the smallest of gestures. In her late 60s, she had silver-streaked hair tied neatly into a bun, her eyes still bright with the fire of a younger, more adventurous self. Though time had etched fine lines across her face, her smile carried an ageless charm that could light up a room. She dressed simply but elegantly, a pastel blouse tucked neatly into her pressed slacks, complemented by a string of pearls that had once belonged to her late mother. Margaret wasn't just an ordinary elderly woman navigating the quiet years of her life. Decades earlier, she had been a trailblazer, a sharp-minded entrepreneur who had built and managed a chain of boutique stores across the state. Known for her ability to turn challenges into opportunities, Margaret had earned respect from her peers and loyalty from her employees. But life, as it often does, had thrown curveballs her way. She lost her husband to an unexpected illness, and with her children grown and scattered across the country, Margaret chose to sell her business and retreat into a quieter, more reflective life. Today, she found purpose in the little things, tending to her garden, volunteering at the local library, and being an active part of her grandchildren's lives. On this particular day, Margaret had a special mission. Her granddaughter, Emily, was graduating at the top of her class, and Margaret wanted to find a gift that would be both meaningful and timeless. She decided to visit the Grand Central Mall, a bustling hub of activity in her town, in search of the perfect present, a delicate silver locket she had seen advertised weeks earlier. Standing at the entrance of the mall, scanning the crowd with an air of superiority, was Mr. Carl Benson, the mall's head security guard. Carl, in his late 30s, carried himself with the self-importance of someone who believed his uniform granted him ultimate authority. His posture was rigid, his expression stern, and his tone curt whenever he addressed patrons. The walkie-talkie clipped to his belt was more of a symbol of his self-proclaimed power than a tool for actual emergencies. Carl had worked at the mall for over 5 years, climbing the ranks to his current position. But his promotion wasn't a result of exceptional service. Rather, it came from his willingness to enforce rules without question and to handle disputes with a strict, no-nonsense approach. He thrived on authority and often mistook rudeness for professionalism. Patrons who had encountered him described him as overzealous, impatient, and at times outright discriminatory. Carl had a history of targeting people he considered out of place. Teenagers, elderly individuals, and those he judged by their appearances were often the focus of his harsh demeanor. His biased behavior had been reported to management on a few occasions, but since Carl was efficient at maintaining order, the complaints were dismissed as isolated incidents. On this day, Carl was in an especially foul mood. A minor scuffle earlier had left him irritated, and he was looking for any reason to assert his authority. When his eyes landed on Mrs. Margaret Hayes, walking slowly toward the mall entrance, he immediately made a snap judgment. To him, she didn't look like someone who belonged there. Her simple attire and cautious gait struck him as suspicious, and he decided to approach her. The Grand Central Mall was a sprawling complex of sleek modern architecture with towering glass walls that allowed natural sunlight to flood the spacious interior. The air inside was filled with a mix of aromas: freshly brewed coffee from the cafe near the entrance, the enticing smell of buttery pretzels from the food court, and the faint hint of polished wood from the boutique shops. Shoppers bustled about, their conversations blending into a lively hum that echoed through the corridors. Families wandered in groups, children clinging to their parents' hands as they eyed toy stores in anticipation. Young couples strolled hand in hand, stopping occasionally to admire displays of designer clothing or sparkling jewelry. It was a vibrant, welcoming place, designed to make every visitor feel at ease. Margaret marveled at the mall's grandeur as she stepped inside, her gaze lingering on the beautiful fountain that stood in the center of the atrium. It had been years since she had visited this mall, and the sheer scale of it was a bit overwhelming. Still, she smiled to herself, determined to find the locket that would soon adorn her granddaughter's neck. Little did she know, her peaceful afternoon was about to be disrupted by an unwarranted confrontation, one that would set off a chain of events neither she nor Carl Benson could have anticipated. Mrs. Margaret Hayes sat on a bench, just outside the mall, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her purse. The sting of humiliation weighed heavily on her, but beneath her composed exterior, a fire burned. It wasn't the first time she had been judged by her appearance, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Memories of her younger years, when she had fought to establish herself in a world that constantly underestimated her, began to flood her mind. Back then, as a young businesswoman, Margaret had faced countless instances of prejudice and dismissive attitudes, yet she had always managed to rise above them with her intelligence, patience, and an unshakable sense of self-worth. Today's incident was no different, she decided. She wouldn't let Mr. Benson, the overzealous security guard, reduce her to just an old lady. But what could she do? And how could she ensure this didn't happen to anyone else? As Mrs. Hayes sat deep in thought, a voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, ma'am," said a young woman hesitantly. She was wearing the uniform of a mall employee, and her eyes were filled with a mix of shame and empathy. "I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry for what happened in there." Mrs. Hayes looked up, surprised. "Oh, thank you, dear, but you're not the one who should be apologizing." The young woman nodded, her face troubled. "I know, but Mr. Benson has been treating people like this for months. He thinks he owns the place. I've seen him humiliate customers, kick out teens for no reason, and even yell at other employees. But no one's ever done anything about it." Margaret's eyebrows furrowed. "Why not?" "People are scared," the woman admitted. "He has connections with the mall's management, so they turn a blind eye. But what he did to you, that was wrong. And people saw it." Margaret's heart softened at the girl's sincerity, but her resolve hardened. "Thank you for telling me. What's your name?" "Emily," the girl said with a faint smile. "Well, Emily," Margaret said, standing up, "it seems we both have a problem with Mr. Benson. Let's see what we can do about it." Unknown to Mrs. Hayes, several bystanders had recorded the incident on their phones. Clips of Mr. Benson aggressively confronting the elderly woman began circulating on social media. The hashtag #Justice for Margaret started trending within hours, with thousands of people expressing their outrage. "Elderly woman thrown out of the mall for no reason," read one caption. "Where's the humanity?" asked another. People demanded accountability, calling out the mall management for allowing such behavior. Local news outlets picked up the story, interviewing witnesses and replaying the footage repeatedly. Meanwhile, Margaret, unaware of the online storm, began formulating her next steps. Emily had given her plenty of information about Mr. Benson's pattern of behavior, and she intended to use it. But she also knew that simply confronting him wouldn't be enough. She had to address the root of the problem, the culture of indifference that allowed someone like Mr. Benson to thrive. Margaret's experience as a businesswoman came rushing back as she sat at her kitchen table that evening. She pulled out her laptop, reviewing every connection she had built over the years. If there was one thing she knew, it was how to get things done. She began by calling an old friend, Mr. Samuel Green, who had once served as the CEO of a major retail chain. Samuel had retired years ago, but still maintained ties to the business world. After catching him up on the day's events, she asked him for advice. "Margaret," he said after listening, "the mall's management should be quaking in their boots right now. If this goes any further, they could face a PR nightmare." "Good," Margaret said firmly. "I want them to take this seriously." "And they will," Samuel assured her. But I'll do you one better. Did you know that Mall's parent company has been quietly looking to sell off its properties? I heard that one's struggling financially. Margaret's eyes lit up. Are you saying it's for sale? Exactly. And if you're interested, I can put you in touch with someone on their board. Margaret smiled, a plan forming in her mind. Oh, I'm very interested. The next morning, Margaret wasted no time. Armed with the contact information Samuel had provided, she reached out to a member of the mall's board of directors. After explaining who she was and dropping a few well-known names from her business network, she secured a meeting with the board. The meeting took place over a video call later that afternoon. Margaret didn't hold back, recounting her experience with Mr. Benson and sharing the viral videos that had sparked public outrage. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice steady but firm. This is about the culture you've allowed to fester in your mall. If you don't take action, you're going to lose the trust of your customers and possibly your entire business. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, Mr. Henry Lawson, spoke up. Mrs. Hayes, we sincerely apologize for what happened to you. Please rest assured that we'll be addressing the issue with Mr. Benson immediately. That's not enough, Margaret said. I understand your mall is struggling financially. I'd like to propose a solution. Allergy, hello. Margaret's proposal was bold. She offered to purchase the mall outright. With her experience in retail and her newfound public support, she argued she was uniquely positioned to turn things around. This mall has the potential to be a thriving community hub, she said, but only if it's managed with integrity and a commitment to treating every customer with respect. The board members were initially hesitant, but Margaret's reputation and the ongoing social media backlash made her offer hard to refuse. After hours of negotiations, they finally reached an agreement. Margaret would buy the mall at a reduced price with the condition that she would oversee its immediate restructuring. As news of Margaret's deal spread, the public rallied behind her. Supporters flooded the mall's social media pages with messages of encouragement, pledging to shop there once she took over. Local businesses reached out, offering partnerships and sponsorships. Margaret, however, remained focused on her ultimate goal, creating a safe, welcoming space for everyone. And she knew exactly where to start, with Mr. Benson. Mrs. Hayes sits in her cozy home, surrounded by files and documents related to her recent business dealings. Her quiet life has been turned upside down by the events at the mall, but she embraces the challenge with calm determination. With her years of business acumen, she finalizes the purchase of the mall. The official paperwork is signed, sealed, and delivered. She is now the proud owner of the very place where she was humiliated just days earlier. The news spreads quickly. The same social media channels that had shared videos of the incident now erupt with updates about Mrs. Hayes' stunning purchase. Headlines read, "From humiliation to ownership, elderly woman's inspiring comeback." People are amazed at the turn of events, and public support for Mrs. Hayes grows even stronger. On the morning of her first day as the mall's owner, Mrs. Hayes walks into the building with quiet confidence. She wears a sharp but simple business suit, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and her eyes radiating strength. Her presence commands attention. The staff, mall employees, and even shoppers notice the change in her demeanor. The same elderly woman who had been thrown out just days ago is now a figure of authority. Mrs. Hayes calls a public meeting in the central atrium of the mall. The board of directors, mall staff, shop owners, and even curious patrons gather around. Standing at the podium, Mrs. Hayes addresses the crowd. "Good morning, everyone," she begins, her voice steady and warm. "A few days ago, I was treated unfairly in this very mall, a place that should welcome everyone with respect and dignity. But today, I stand here as the new owner of this mall, and I want to share my vision for what this place should represent." The crowd erupts in applause, some people cheering while others wipe away tears. Mrs. Hayes continues, speaking about her plans to transform the mall into a space of fairness, inclusion, and community support. She announces that she will implement new policies to ensure that everyone, regardless of age, appearance, or background, is treated with respect. She pauses and looks around the room, making eye contact with several people. "No one should ever feel the way I felt that day, and I will make sure this place is an example of kindness, professionalism, and equality." The crowd responds with another wave of applause. Shoppers, employees, and even some board members feel a deep sense of hope and excitement for the future of the mall under Mrs. Hayes' leadership. Just as the applause dies down, Mrs. Hayes calls Mr. Benson, the security guard, to the front of the room. He hesitates, but eventually steps forward, his face pale and his body tense. The crowd shifts uneasily, sensing the tension in the air. "Mr. Benson," Mrs. Hayes begins, her voice firm but not unkind. "A few days ago, you treated me, and likely many others, with disrespect and prejudice. Your actions were unprofessional, and they do not align with the values this mall should uphold." Mr. Benson fidgets nervously, unable to meet her gaze. The crowd watches intently, some whispering among themselves. "In front of this community, I want to make it clear that such behavior will not be tolerated," Mrs. Hayes continues. "Effective immediately, you are dismissed from your position as security guard." Gasps ripple through the crowd. Some people cheer, while others nod in agreement. Mr. Benson looks stunned, his face flushed with embarrassment. He opens his mouth to protest, but quickly closes it, realizing that he has no defense. Mrs. Hayes softens her tone slightly. "I hope this experience teaches you the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. This is not just about punishment, it's about growth and change. I wish you well in your future endeavors." The crowd erupts in applause again, this time louder and more enthusiastic than before. Mr. Benson lowers his head and walks away, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. As he leaves, Mrs. Hayes turns back to the crowd. "Let this be a new beginning for all of us," she says. "Together, we will create a mall that welcomes everyone and sets an example of how we should treat one another." The atmosphere is electric with hope and inspiration. Employees feel motivated, shoppers feel valued, and Mrs. Hayes stands tall, knowing she has not only reclaimed her dignity, but also created a positive change for the community. Mrs. Hayes strolled through the mall's gleaming corridors, her step light and confident, but her heart was filled with a quiet gratitude. It had been a few months since the incident with the upscale store, and her life had taken an unexpected yet incredibly fulfilling turn. As she passed through the mall, staff and patrons alike seemed to recognize her, offering warm smiles and nods of acknowledgement. It was as if the energy in the air had shifted, and a subtle, yet undeniable sense of respect permeated every corner of the space. As she approached the store that had once cast her out, the sight of it no longer filled her with anger or resentment. In fact, it was the opposite. It felt like the start of something new. The store had undergone a complete transformation. The polished glass doors now swung open, revealing an inviting, warm atmosphere. The previously cold and detached environment had been replaced with one that embraced kindness and inclusivity. Mrs. Hayes had taken the opportunity, with the support of a few generous investors and local allies, to reopen the boutique. It wasn't just a business venture, it was a mission. The walls were adorned with inspirational messages about compassion, acceptance, and unity. A portion of the proceeds now went toward local charities that helped those in need, including homeless shelters and youth mentorship programs. It was a place where everyone, regardless of their background or appearance, was made to feel welcome. She smiled as she stepped inside, greeted by familiar faces. The employees, who had once treated her with cold indifference, now looked at her with respect and admiration. They had seen the transformation not just in the store but in themselves. The culture of the mall had shifted. There was a new standard of kindness and empathy that extended beyond the store's walls, one that had reached deep into the heart of the community. As Mrs. Hayes moved further into the store, she was met by a young woman, Sarah, who had been working as a part-time employee at the mall when Mrs. Hayes first visited. Sarah had been the one to stand up for her when the manager had tried to eject her from the store. The two had struck up a conversation that day, and Sarah had expressed her own frustrations with the lack of inclusivity and empathy in the mall's culture. Sarah now stood in front of Mrs. Hayes, beaming with pride. "Mrs. Hayes, I can't believe it. This store, your store, it's everything I hoped for. I've never worked somewhere that values people like this." Mrs. Hayes smiled back, her eyes softening. "You're part of this, Sarah. You stood by what was right when no one else would. That's what made all the difference." As the conversation continued, Mrs. Hayes could tell that Sarah had blossomed in her new role. The young woman had been promoted to a managerial position not long after the store's reopening. She was an embodiment of the change that had come to the mall. A fresh start, a new chapter. Sarah had helped spearhead the store's community outreach initiatives, ensuring that its message of inclusivity reached even further than before. "We're just getting started," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "There's so much we can do." Mrs. Hayes felt a deep sense of pride. Sarah's promotion wasn't just a personal achievement. It was a sign of the mall's new direction. The once rigid, impersonal atmosphere had been replaced by one of empathy and understanding. More employees from other stores had begun to adopt the same values, fostering an environment that celebrated diversity rather than shunned it. The mall, which had once been a place of superficiality, had transformed into a thriving hub of support and collaboration. Mrs. Hayes had played a crucial role in that change. Her act of courage, standing up for her own dignity and refusing to be treated as less than, had sparked a ripple effect that had touched the lives of so many people. She had turned her painful experience into an opportunity for growth, not only for herself, but for the entire community. As Mrs. Hayes prepared to leave the store, that day, she paused by the front window, gazing out at the bustling mall. It was a different place now, more vibrant, more connected, more human. And it was because of the kindness that had flowed from the small actions of people like Sarah and the courage of those who had stood up for what was right. The mall felt alive in a way it never had before. The walls, once cold and sterile, now seemed to pulse with energy. Mrs. Hayes could feel it all around her, the sense of hope, the quiet but unshakable belief that things could be better, that people could be better. The once fragmented and divided community had come together, bound by a simple truth. Kindness mattered. It was a busy afternoon when Mrs. Hayes stood before a crowd of mall patrons and staff, preparing to deliver a speech that she had been thinking about for weeks. She had been invited to speak at the mall's annual gathering, an event that brought together the different stores, employees and customers to celebrate the achievements of the year. This year, however, the atmosphere was different. There was a new sense of unity, a renewed commitment to creating a space that embraced everyone. As she stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. Mrs. Hayes could feel the weight of the moment, but she wasn't nervous. She knew the words that needed to be said, and they had been waiting inside her for a long time. She took a deep breath and began. "When I first came here, I was treated with disrespect. I was dismissed, overlooked, and made to feel like I didn't belong. And I know I'm not the only one who's experienced that," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But what happened after that was something I never expected. I found kindness in places I didn't anticipate. I found courage in the people who chose to stand by what was right. I found strength in every single one of you who believed that we could make this place better together. There was a pause, and Mrs. Hayes looked out over the crowd. She saw familiar faces, the staff members who had joined her journey, the patrons who had become her allies, and even the young employees who had come to understand the true meaning of respect. She smiled softly. It's easy to think that the things that matter most are the things we can see, she continued. The clothes we wear, the stores we shop in, the way we look. But those things don't define us. What defines us is how we treat one another, the kindness we offer, the respect we show, the understanding we extend. That is what creates a community. That is what creates a place where everyone can thrive. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. Dignity, perseverance, and kindness, they triumph over prejudice and cruelty. And that's the change I see in this mall now. We are a place where everyone is welcome. We are a place where compassion drives our actions. And we are a place where we lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. The room was silent for a moment, and then slowly, applause began to fill the air. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if everyone was absorbing the weight of her words. But then it grew, louder and more fervent, until the entire room was filled with the sound of clapping and cheers. Mrs. Hayes stood at the podium, her heart swelling with pride. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Not the recognition, not the applause, but the understanding that what she had done had mattered. It had made a difference. As the applause died down, Mrs. Hayes continued, her voice now filled with warmth and hope. So, let us continue to support each other. Let us continue to spread kindness wherever we go. Let us continue to build a community that celebrates what makes each of us unique, because that is what will make us stronger. Together, we can create a place where kindness is not just an ideal, but a way of life. The room erupted into applause again, and this time, Mrs. Hayes allowed herself a moment to savor it. She had fought for this, for herself, for Sarah, for the community. She had turned a painful experience into something beautiful, and now the whole mall stood as a testament to that transformation. As Mrs. Hayes left the gathering that evening, the mall around her seemed to glow with a new energy. She could feel the weight of her journey, but she also felt the joy that came from knowing she had helped create something meaningful. The challenges she had faced, prejudice, rejection, and heartache, had not been easy. But through it all, she had stayed true to her values, dignity, perseverance, and kindness. She reflected on the path she had walked, the moments when it had seemed as though nothing would change, and the moments when hope had burned brightest. It wasn't just about the success of the store or the changes in the mall. It was about the way people had come together, the way they had chosen to treat one another with respect and compassion. In the end, it was not about fighting against the prejudice she had faced, but about creating something better, a community that valued kindness, a place where everyone could feel seen, heard, and appreciated. That was the true victory. And Mrs. Hayes knew that this was just the beginning. She turned to look back at the storefront one last time, a soft smile on her lips. The words she had spoken that afternoon weren't just for the crowd. They were for herself too. She had learned that no matter what, kindness would always triumph. And as long as she continued to live with integrity and compassion, she knew she would always have a place in the world. The grand day had arrived, the long-anticipated public celebration of the mall's relaunch. It was a day that had been years in the making, filled with passion, perseverance, and the unwavering belief that kindness could change everything. The mall, once a place of exclusivity and superficiality, had become a beacon of hope, community, and inclusivity. And at the center of it all stood Mrs. Hayes, a woman whose courage had sparked a revolution in the very heart of this bustling space. The mall had been transformed, not just in its physical appearance, but in its culture. The vibrant banners that adorned the walls celebrated unity, respect, and the strength that came from diversity. The once sterile and impersonal shops were now filled with warmth and light, their employees embodying the values of kindness that Mrs. Hayes had instilled. The transformation was not just cosmetic, it was deeply rooted in the way people interacted with one another. Mrs. Hayes stood backstage, looking at the crowd gathered outside. The mall's relaunch event was drawing a large crowd, with hundreds of people, customers, employees, local dignitaries, gathering to witness the momentous occasion. It was a turning point for both the mall and the community. The day was full of speeches, performances, and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, but it was Mrs. Hayes' address that everyone was waiting for. As she walked onto the stage, the crowd fell into a hushed silence. Mrs. Hayes was dressed simply, but there was a strength in the way she carried herself, in the way she held her head high. The applause that followed her entrance was loud and heartfelt, but she didn't let it overwhelm her. This was her moment to share her story, to speak the truth that had guided her every step of the way. She took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces before her. There were many familiar faces in the crowd. Sarah, the young woman who had stood by her side from the very beginning, the loyal employees who had believed in her vision, the patrons who had supported her throughout the journey. And then there were new faces, people who had come to see for themselves the transformation that had taken place. "Thank you all for being here today," Mrs. Hayes began, her voice steady, but with an underlying current of emotion. "Today isn't just about the relaunch of this mall, it's about the launch of something bigger, something more meaningful. It's about the change we've made together, the change that starts with kindness, with respect, and with the courage to stand up for what's right." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "When I first came to this mall, I was thrown out because of the way I looked. I was judged, humiliated, and made to feel less than. But that experience was not my defeat. It was my turning point. I knew that I couldn't let that injustice stand. I knew that if I could stand up for myself, others would too. And together, we would make this mall a place where everyone is welcome." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Mrs. Hayes could see the impact her story was having, the way her words were resonating with those in the audience. You see, change doesn't happen overnight. It's not easy, and it's not always comfortable. But every step we've taken, every challenge we've overcome, has brought us closer to a world where kindness is the norm, where we don't judge people based on their appearance or status, but by the way they treat others. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. "I stand here today, not just as the owner of this mall, but as a woman who has learned the true power of perseverance, dignity, and community. And I owe it to all of you, those of you who stood by me, who believed in this vision. Without your support, this would not have been possible." The crowd erupted into applause, but Mrs. Hayes wasn't finished yet. She stepped forward to the edge of the stage, looking directly at the audience. "But this isn't just my victory, it's our victory. This mall is a symbol of what happens when we come together, when we decide to act with empathy and compassion. We have created a space where people can find belonging, where every person, regardless of their background, is treated with respect and dignity." She looked down for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The world can be harsh, but we have the power to make it better, to make it kinder, to make it a place where everyone has a chance to thrive, not because of who they are on the outside, but because of who they are on the inside. That's the future I see for this mall, a future built on compassion, on understanding, and on the belief that we can always do better. As she finished speaking, there was another round of applause, this time even louder, more passionate. Mrs. Hayes could see tears in some of the faces in the crowd, tears of joy, of relief, and of hope. She had done what she set out to do. She had created something meaningful, something that would leave a legacy for future generations. But it wasn't just the physical transformation of the mall that mattered. It was the transformation of the people who walked through it. The young employee, Sarah, had become a symbol of this change. She was standing off to the side of the stage now, her eyes glistening with pride. Sarah's promotion had been more than just a job title. It was a reflection of the new culture that Mrs. Hayes had created, one where integrity and kindness were rewarded. The emotional weight of the moment was palpable. This was the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and a commitment to doing what was right. Mrs. Hayes had proven that one person standing up for what they believe in could make a difference. And she had made that difference here, in this very space. As the applause died down, Mrs. Hayes stepped back from the podium, her heart full. She had said what she needed to say, but there was one final message she wanted to leave the crowd with. She looked out over the audience, her eyes meeting those of the people who had supported her and those who had yet to find their place in this new world of kindness and inclusion. "What would you do," she asked softly, "if life gave you a chance to right a wrong? Would you stand up for what's right? Would you fight for a better future, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you?" The room grew quiet as each person took a moment to reflect on her question. "Don't wait for someone else to make the change," she continued, her voice steady but full of emotion. "You have the power to make a difference. You have the power to make the world kinder, more just, and more compassionate. It starts with one act, one choice, one person, and that person can be you." The camera zoomed in on Mrs. Hayes, her eyes filled with determination and hope. "So I ask you, what will you do?" As the screen faded to black, a narrator's voice emerged, echoing Mrs. Hayes's message. "We all have a story. We all have a chance to make a difference. Share your story with us. Tell us about a time when you stood up against injustice or showed kindness to someone in need. Together, we can create a world where kindness is the norm. Share your experiences in the comments and join the movement." The words lingered in the air as the screen showed a final image of the mall. A place where change had been made and where the future looked brighter than ever.